Hey, welcome to the podcast, Travel Writing and Cultural Perspectives. Your host here, Jose Salazar. I will be talking about, well, of course, the topic at hand, travel writing and cultural perspectives, and more into detail about that is my research paper and how I could have, or how I went about it, and how I could have done it differently to help foster a better, more efficient paper. Now, for the episode today, I plan on covering the topic as extensively as I can, as well as introduce successfully my resources. And at the end of those resources, I will do a little bit of introduction on my research and analysis, but that will probably be for the next episode of the podcast. Now, for my topic at hand is travel writing, and more specifically, travel writing on on learning of different cultures of people and students in the RGV. And so the reason or the way I came up with this topic was that at first I wanted to do something over nature, right? Because nature is this beautiful thing. It's something so masterfully created and so different, so unique. It doesn't matter where you go, there will always be different things in nature, especially around you. Example of this is, America, United States of America, and then you compare that to Mexico, to England, to Australia, to Russia. It's vastly different in nature, and it's just very fascinating. And so I thought it would be very cool to learn about how this nature can impact your learning, especially when it comes to learning of different cultures, and how this travel writing would impact you, or how not necessarily travel writing, but how this impacted you when it came to learning, right? And so the topic was actually it actually came to fruition when I discussed it with my professor, and I decided that I would go into the topic of travel writing. And the reason I chose travel writing is because travel writing is something that's just very academic, it's very, very helpful, and it helps, you know, it's a tool to explain the differences in culture between different places, whether it be the differences in the culture in the Rio Grande Valley, its neighboring cities such as Dana, Mercedes, Wasaco, or even, difference between states. And this is this is interesting because, or this is my topic, and I chose it because it's something that's very fascinating, and it helps it helps you realize that travel writing is actually a very, very efficient tool when it comes to learning about different cultures. And so when I started doing some research, I decided to gather three sources, and my three sources were a TEDx talk, a book, and finally a article, or not an article, a research journal by a individual in the field. And so these topics specifically are travel writing, which is a book written by Carl Thompson in 2011. And this book goes into depth about the entire concept of travel writing throughout human history. And what this source revealed to me was that the main idea of travel writing was that travel writing is a way to reveal not only yourself but others, and this is evident because of the ways travel writing was used throughout history, such as by Europeans exploring foreign lands, and especially with Christopher Columbus, right? And also, people who went to distant lands because of war and how they perceived that culture, that environment differently than they perceived it, or they would have perceived it if they were, in the shoes of the citizens of that, studied ecosystem and studied a nature environment. And my second source is the TEDx talk "Where is Home" by Pico Iyer, done 2013. in which it brought to light the concept of movement as well as the general concept of what home can really be defined as. Because when you think about it, home isn't just a place where you live, where you sleep. It's it's much more than that. And I, for one, related to this when the main idea was that home is where you stand because that's the place you always have to go back to. I related to this because my parents were divorced and I was very young. And so I had to go between both households. And I never necessarily saw one home as or one location as like my home, but instead I thought, well, this very location around me is special. And it had this change on my perspective in that in order for me to feel good or not feel good about myself, but feel content and feel safe. And then the question is that is the best I can get at that very moment, and it's something that I should be grateful to have because not many others have it. And so I was brought up with this in mind, where if I'm here, as long as I have this, I can survive, or have that. And whether it be food, or bed, a roof over your head, it's something that made me see home in a different manner than what most people see it as. And finally, the third source, travel writing in children and adolescents literature in Iran, which was an article by Jalali Maryam in 2016 that talked about the importance of travel writing in children and adolescents literature. And so the main idea for this was that the perspectives of children and adolescents in Iran, especially in this given source, of different cultures is different than that of residents of said culture. And I myself connected this because I fell victim to the writing and stories I had heard about Mexico. However, when I finally visited it with my family, it was something entirely different. What I had pictured was a violent, unstable place that had, crime. But in reality, it's just like the United States of America. It's a place bustling with people, and it has its own culture, its own very thing that makes it special about it. And of course, it was not the same, but it was completely different than what I had imagined it would have been. And so these three sources were chosen because of their connection to travel writing, and some comparisons that I found in between these sources was that the writing conceived by Carl Thompson in travel writing, and then travel writing in children adolescents literature in Iran, what by Jalali Maryam, was that they were similar in that similar in travel writing is important because it includes different unique perspectives of the aspects of life, considering the diversity of culture. And this is evident in how travel writing saw it put out there that these Europeans saw the Indians, the natives, in a very different light than perhaps what the natives would have seen themselves, and back and forth how the natives would have seen the Europeans, whereas the Europeans see themselves. And it's just this interesting idea of perspective and the different perspectives there are in the world. The other difference, or the other similarity, was that travel writing in children and adolescents literature by Jalali Maryam and Pico Iyer's TEDx Talk were similar in that they both put emphasis on travel, movement, and its importance. And just movement and travel is important in that it's something that exposes you to new things, new locations, new culture, new ideas. And finally, a relationship between the Pico Iyer's TED Talk, Where is Home, and Travel Writing in Children and Adolescents Literature by Jalali Maryam, in which it had a cause and effect relationship, in which Pico stated that where you are and movement is important, whereas Malali's idea of people having different tastes and perspectives would be a direct result of where people reside and consider their home. Um, when it comes to testing the claims of the authors against my own experiences, I agreed with the general beliefs and conclusions stated by all three authors, which were Iyer, Miriam, Thompson. And it just shows that travel writing is something that can be used as an effective tool to show how different cultures view different people in entirely different lights than how they might imagine they're viewed themselves. And how this travel writing, this very same tool that helps people see differently, can be used to spread this diversity of culture among other people by opening the minds of these other people to these different perspectives. Now, to elaborate on this, is travel writing, especially in, you see, okay, travel writing, I had no idea what travel writing was before I, made an attempt to research the idea of travel writing, when I began research on this paper. And so it's interesting because before I thought nothing of the idea of, like, traveling somewhere and then writing about your experience and how you viewed this different culture. I saw writing as like a tool of just academic, and and of course travel writing could be considered academic. When I would argue it is actually, but I had been introduced to this idea of travel writing by my professor because they recommended this article about travel writing, and it was just very interesting. And so travel writing just goes to show that whenever you think that you know everything, there's always going to be something that you don't know, because it's something that would be viewed under a different tool, a different setting. And this idea of travel writing is just very interesting. And so, in order to test, the perspectives that Iyer, Maryam, and Thompson had, I came to the, or I went and did a little more in-depth research on these resources, and I found out that none of them had any connections to how travel writing affects learning of different cultures in the Rio Grande Valley. And so I thought that this mattered because the people in the Rio Grande Valley, myself included, we are a diverse and populous community, and that the failure to mention us would mean that there is lack in our representation of our culture and our way of life in travel writing. And so I did a designing of a research tool in which I made 10 research questions, and then I had 5 follow-up questions to those questions, and I plan to use them for an interview. And so this this research um, this research method is going to be employed and explained in the very next episode. Thank you for tuning in. I'm really hope that you enjoyed what you heard, and I can't wait to see you on the next podcast episode. Thank you.